In the heart of Saxony, perched on a rocky spur overlooking the river Mulde, stands a fortress. For centuries, its stone walls have witnessed the tides of European history, serving as a royal hunting lodge, a sanatorium for the wealthy, and even a psychiatric hospital. But by 1940, this place would earn a new infamous name in the annals of the Second World War, Oflag IVC. To the world it was known simply as Colditz. Colditz was not just another prisoner of war camp, it was a Sonderlager a special camp, conceived by the German High Command as the ultimate solution to a persistent Allied problem, escape. The men sent here were the elite of the Allied officer corps, not in rank but in spirit. They were the serial escapers, the troublemakers, the incorrigibles who had tried to break free from every other camp they had been held in. The British, the French, the Dutch, the Poles, they were all here. The Germans believed that by concentrating these restless souls into one formidable, supposedly escape-proof fortress, they could finally contain them. It was a theory that would be tested to its absolute limits. The castle itself was a daunting labyrinth of courtyards, towers, and sheer stone walls. Its windows were barred, its doors were locked, and its perimeter was a web of barbed wire and searchlights. Sentries patrolled the grounds day and night, their footsteps an ever-present reminder of captivity. The prisoners called their guards goons, a term of derision that hid a grudging respect for their efficiency. Every corner, every shadow, was subject to their watchful eyes. To escape from Colditz was considered a fantasy, a fool's errand. Yet for the men imprisoned within those walls, escape was not a fantasy. It was a duty. Under the Geneva Convention, a prisoner of war had an obligation to try to escape, to rejoin the fight and tie up enemy resources in the process. At Colditz, this duty was elevated to an art form. Escape became the central organizing principle of life, a full-time clandestine industry. An escape committee, composed of senior officers from each nationality, vetted and coordinated every plan, ensuring that multiple attempts did not interfere with one another, and that resources were used wisely. The methods were as varied as the men who conceived them. They dug tunnels, their progress measured in inches per day. They impersonated German officers, dressed in meticulously crafted fake uniforms. They hid in crates, contorted themselves into laundry carts, and brazenly tried to walk out the front gate in disguise. Most attempts failed, ending with a prisoner being recaptured just outside the walls, or sometimes, tragically, with a gunshot in the dark. But failure did not breed despair. It only fueled a greater determination, a more audacious creativity. Inside the prisoners' quarters, life was a strange mix of crushing boredom and feverish secret activity. By day they maintained an appearance of languor, playing sports in the courtyard, reading books from the camp library, or attending lectures given by fellow officers. But beneath this placid surface a secret war was being waged. Tailors stitched civilian clothes and German uniforms from blankets and stolen cloth. Forgers created flawless identity papers, complete with official-looking stamps carved from rubber boot heels. Tinsmiths fashioned compasses and wire cutters from scavenged metal. Every object, no matter how mundane, was assessed for its escape potential. The psychological pressure was immense. The constant surveillance, the lack of privacy, the gnawing uncertainty of their fate, it was a heavy burden. To combat the mental decay that captivity could bring, the men had to find a purpose. For many, that purpose was the singular goal of getting out. But as the war dragged on into 1943 and 1944, a new and more sinister fear began to creep into the minds of the prisoners. News from the outside world, smuggled in on secret radios, told of a turning tide. The Allies were advancing on all fronts. But victory was not yet assured, and whispers grew of the fanatical SS taking control of prisoner of war camps as the Reich crumbled. The men of Colditz, branded as the most troublesome and defiant of Allied prisoners, feared they would be a prime target for a last-minute reprisal, a final brutal massacre. The need to escape was no longer just a matter of duty, it was becoming a matter of survival. But individual escapes were difficult and dangerous. What they needed was a plan for a mass breakout, a way to get a significant number of men out, all at once. The problem was, from Colditz that was impossible, or so it seemed. The idea, when it first surfaced, was so outlandish, so utterly improbable that it sounded like a joke. It was born in the mind of a quiet, unassuming Royal Air Force pilot named Bill Goldfinch. Goldfinch was not a brash daredevil. He was a technical man, an engineer at heart. Trapped within the medieval fortress, his mind, like so many others, was constantly searching for a chink in the castle's armor. He had considered all the usual methods, tunnels, disguises, and ropes. But the Germans were wise to them all. Goldfinch knew that the only way to truly surprise them was to do something they could never conceive of. His inspiration came from an unlikely source, a book on aircraft design he had read in the camp library, and perhaps a diagram on a cigarette card. He began to sketch, to calculate. The problem was not how to get over the walls or under them, but how to bypass them entirely. The solution he envisioned was radical. They would fly out. They would build a glider. When Goldfinch first presented his idea to his fellow inmates, the reaction was one of stunned disbelief, followed by laughter. Build a two-man aircraft inside a heavily guarded prison, using only scavenged materials, and launch it from the roof. The notion was preposterous. It was a page from a boy's adventure novel, not a serious escape plan, but Goldfinch was persistent. With him was his friend and fellow flyer Jack Best. Together they refined the proposal, drawing up detailed blueprints and calculations. They took their plan to the head of the British Escape Committee, Colonel William Todd. To their surprise, the senior officers did not dismiss it out of hand. They saw the logic behind the madness. A glider launch would be swift, silent, and completely unexpected. If it could be done, it offered the best chance of getting men clear of the castle before the alarm could be raised. It was a desperate measure for desperate times. The plan, codenamed the Colditz Cock, was officially approved. With the blessing of the committee, Goldfinch and Best assembled their team. The core group consisted of just a dozen men, each chosen for their specific skills. The third key figure to join was a young army officer and pre-war motor racing enthusiast named Tony Rolt. Rolt was a natural mechanic, a man with an intuitive understanding of how things worked. He would later go on to win the 24 Hours of Le Mans. But here, in the heart of enemy territory, his engineering talents would be put to their greatest test. Goldfinch would lead the design, Best would assist with construction and serve as the second pilot, and Rolt would be the chief engineer, the problem solver who could turn abstract ideas into tangible components. Their first and most critical challenge was finding a place to work. Where, in a castle teeming with guards and prisoners alike, could one build a glider with a wingspan of 32 feet and a length of nearly 20? The workshop had to be large, remote, and above all, completely secret. After weeks of careful reconnaissance, exploring every forgotten corner of the sprawling castle, they found the perfect spot. High above the castle's chapel, at the far end of the German quarters, was a long, narrow attic. It was sealed off, dark, and filled with the dust of decades. More importantly, it was believed to be inaccessible. The only way to reach it was to break through the wall of another, smaller attic space. The team set to work, carefully removing bricks and plaster to create a small, hidden entrance. They then constructed a false wall, a masterpiece of deception made from old packing crates, mud and dust, so perfectly camouflaged that it was invisible to the naked eye. It looked as if it had been there for 100 years. Accessing the secret workshop was an operation of immense risk. The route led through the upper floors of the German barracks, an area strictly off-limits to prisoners. To get there, the construction team had to pass through multiple locked doors and climb to the very top of the castle, all without being seen. This required a level of coordination and security that was in itself a work of genius. The prisoners established an elaborate lookout system, a human warning network that spanned the entire castle. These lookouts, known as stooges, were placed at strategic vantage points. They developed a complex system of signals, a cough, a whistle, the flick of a towel from a window that could be passed silently from one man to the next, alerting the glider team of an approaching guard. A guard leaving his office at one end of the castle would trigger a signal that would reach the workshop within seconds, giving the workers just enough time to scramble back through their hidden doorway, replace the false wall, and melt back into the general prison population. It was a nerve-wracking high-wire act performed daily for nearly a year. Inside the workshop, the atmosphere was thick with secrecy and anticipation. The space was long but incredibly narrow and low-ceilinged, forcing the men to work in cramped, stooped positions. The only light came from a few makeshift candles made from scavenged fat, and later from a single electric wire they managed to tap from the chapel's lighting circuit. In this dim, clandestine world, surrounded by the smell of dust, sweat, and boiled porridge, the most audacious engineering project of the war began to take shape. With the workshop secured, the next formidable challenge was sourcing the materials. They had no access to aircraft-grade spruce, no lightweight metal alloys, no modern adhesives. They had to build a flight-worthy aircraft from the detritus of prison life. The ingenuity they displayed was nothing short of miraculous. The primary material for the glider's structure was wood. The team discreetly acquired any piece of timber they could find. The most common source was bed slats. Over many months, prisoners throughout the castle would report their bed slats as broken, receiving replacements from the Germans while the old ones were smuggled to the workshop. Floorboards were carefully pried up from under beds, with the remaining boards spaced out to cover the gaps. Pieces of furniture, particularly long tables from the common rooms, were also dismantled. Each piece of stolen wood had to be meticulously accounted for and, if necessary, replaced with a crude substitute to avoid suspicion during inspections. The longest and most crucial wooden components were the wing spars, the main structural beams of the wings. At over 16 feet long, they were too large to be smuggled into the attic in one piece. The team devised a plan to pass the sections of wood up through a specially created hole in the floor of the workshop, hoisting them from the chapel ceiling below during the brief moments when the chapel was empty. It was a perilous operation, requiring perfect timing and silence. With the wood secured, they needed tools. The Germans provided no such luxuries, so the prisoners made their own. They fashioned a hand drill from a long nail, a saw from a sharpened gramophone spring stretched across a wooden bow, and a carpenter's plane from a steel bed scraper wedged into a block of wood. Every nail pulled from a floorboard, every piece of discarded metal was a treasure carefully collected and repurposed by the workshop team. As the wooden skeleton of the glider slowly came together, the next problem was how to cover it. The wings and fuselage needed to be skinned with a strong, lightweight fabric. For this, the team turned to the prisoners' own bedding. They collected German-issue cotton sleeping bag liners and blue and white checked mattress covers. Hundreds of these small panels had to be painstakingly stitched together by a team of prisoner tailors to create large sheets of fabric capable of covering the entire aircraft. But fabric alone wasn't enough. To make it airtight and rigid, it needed to be treated with dope, a special lacquer used on early aircraft. Their solution was found in their Red Cross parcels. They discovered that by boiling down millet, a grain supplied in their rations, they could create a thick, starchy paste. They experimented with the consistency for weeks, eventually producing a porridge-like glue that, when applied to the cotton sheets, dried into a hard, semi-transparent skin. The entire glider was slowly coated in this sticky, odorous concoction, the men working by candlelight to spread it evenly across the fabric. The construction process was slow and methodical. Goldfinch's design was for a high-wing monoplane, a simple but stable configuration. The team built wooden jigs to ensure that each of the 60 wing ribs was identical, a task requiring immense precision. Day after day, week after week, in the suffocating confines of their hidden workshop, they shaped, sawed, and glued. The fuselage was built as a simple wooden frame, designed to hold two men, one behind the other. The control systems for the rudder, ailerons, and elevators were fashioned from stolen control wires found in an unused section of the castle's electrical conduits. Slowly, impossibly, an aircraft was being born in secret. The men nicknamed it the Colditz Ghost, a fitting name for the spectral semi-translucent machine taking form in the dusty attic. It was a testament not just to their engineering skill, but to their unbreakable will. Every rib, every joint, every stitch was an act of defiance, a quiet statement that even in this place their minds and spirits remained free. By the winter of 1944, the glider was nearing completion. The fuselage was built, the tail section was assembled, and the two great wings were constructed, ready to be attached. But building the aircraft was only half the battle. Now they had to figure out how to launch it. Their chosen launch site was the long sloping roof of the chapel, directly below their workshop. It offered a clear, if terrifyingly short, runway pointing towards the outer wall and the darkness beyond. The plan they devised was as ingenious as the glider itself. First, they would need to break a hole in the attic wall and the chapel roof to move the disassembled glider into position. This would have to be done on the night of the escape, under the cover of darkness and ideally the chaos of an Allied air raid. Once on the roof, the glider would be placed on a small trolley running along a temporary track made of wooden boards. But the roof was far too short for a conventional takeoff. The glider needed to reach a speed of at least 30 miles per hour to become airborne. To achieve this acceleration, Goldfinch and Rolt designed a primitive but powerful catapult. They would lower a huge bathtub filled with concrete and rubble from a high window in the chapel. This bathtub, weighing over a ton, would be connected by a system of ropes and pulleys to the glider's trolley. When the tub was dropped, its immense weight would pull the glider forward, accelerating it down the roof and flinging it into the air. The physics were sound, but the execution would be fraught with danger. The pilots, Goldfinch and Best, would have less than 3 seconds from the moment the tub was dropped to the moment they were launched into space, 60 feet above the ground. There was no room for error. A slight miscalculation, a snapped rope, or a gust of wind at the wrong moment would send them plummeting to their deaths on the stone courtyard below. As 1945 began, the Ghost was complete. The wings were attached, the controls were rigged, and the team was ready. They had done the impossible. In the heart of Hitler's most secure prison, they had built a machine capable of flight. All they needed now was the order to launch. They waited through the cold months of January and February, listening to the drone of Allied bombers overhead, hoping for the air raid that would provide the cover they needed. But the war was moving faster than they could have imagined. In the spring of 1945, the Allied armies were closing in on Germany from all sides. The sounds of distant artillery grew closer each day. The guards in the castle grew nervous, their discipline beginning to fray. For the prisoners, the end of their ordeal was in sight. The fear of an SS massacre began to subside, replaced by the giddy hope of liberation. The escape committee was faced with a difficult choice: risk the lives of two men on a desperate flight for freedom, or wait for the Allied forces who were now just days away. The order to launch the glider never came. On April 16, 1945, the familiar sound of German jackboots was replaced by the rumble of American tanks. The U.S. Army had arrived. Colditz was liberated. The gates were thrown open, and the men who had spent years dreaming of freedom were finally able to walk out into the sunlight, not as escapers, but as free men. The feeling was one of overwhelming relief, but for the glider team it was tinged with a strange sense of anticlimax. Their beautiful secret creation, the product of a year of tireless work and unimaginable risk, would never fulfill its purpose. It would never fly. In the days following the liberation, as reporters and high-ranking officers toured the infamous castle, the story of the glider finally came to light. A small group of British officers, including Bill Goldfinch, led a bewildered American colonel up the winding stairs, through the German quarters, and to the hidden false wall. With a bit of effort they pulled it away, revealing the dark opening behind. They led him into the cramped attic, and there, illuminated by the beams of flashlights, was the Colditz ghost. The American officer was speechless. He stared in disbelief at the fully constructed two-man glider, its checked cotton wings gleaming in the dim light. The German guards who were later shown the discovery were equally astonished. For over a year, under their very noses, a dozen prisoners had built an entire aircraft. It was the ultimate, final act of defiance, a secret they had failed to uncover. The glider was a symbol of an intellectual victory so complete, so audacious, that it defied belief. The fate of the original glider is shrouded in some mystery. It was photographed and documented, a marvel of wartime ingenuity. But shortly after the liberation, the region fell under Soviet control. The glider, left behind in the attic, is believed to have been destroyed, either by the departing prisoners who saw no further use for it, or by the Soviets who had little appreciation for its symbolic power. Its physical form was lost to history, but its legacy endured. The story of the Colditz glider became one of the most celebrated tales of Allied resilience and creativity. For decades, however, a question remained: would it have actually flown? Skeptics wondered if an aircraft made of bed slats and porridge could truly have carried two men to freedom. In the year 2000, a team of British engineers and pilots decided to find out. Using Goldfinch's original drawings and adhering strictly to the materials and tools available to the prisoners, they built a full-scale replica. The replica was put to the test. It not only flew, but it flew beautifully, proving that the prisoner's design was aerodynamically sound. 12 years later, in 2012, another team took the experiment a step further. They built another replica and, with special permission, returned to Colditz Castle. They constructed the same launch ramp on the chapel roof, and using the same concrete-filled bathtub counterweight system, they did what Goldfinch and Best never had the chance to do. They launched the glider from the roof of Colditz. For a few breathtaking seconds, the glider soared through the air before landing safely in the field below. The dream had finally taken flight. The story of the men who built a glider in a German prison is more than just a tale of a daring escape plan. It is a profound testament to the power of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity. It is a story about how, when stripped of freedom, men will find purpose in creation. The glider was never about hatred for their captors. It was about a love for life and liberty. It was a project that kept hope alive in the darkest of places, a secret goal that united a small group of men and gave them a reason to endure. The Colditz ghost never carried its builders to freedom, but in a much deeper sense it had already set them free.